Hi, Steve Smith here, and this is the first of a whole series of CPD, that's continuing professional development presentations to do with second language learning in the classroom. So it's going to be a mix of a little bit of theory, quite a bit of practice thrown in there, and there should be lots to interest teachers, whether you're new or whether you're more experienced. So here we go with our first presentation. And I've started off with the topic of listening. And this one's called a process approach to listening. So what are we talking about here? Firstly, there's been for a while a view that we've perhaps neglected listening as a skill. Maybe it's because it's not something that you can actually see or hear like speech or writing. It's kind of invisible going on in the brain. And maybe we just assume that listening develops naturally and doesn't need particular teaching. That's one first thought. The second thought is that obviously listening is really hard. I mean, when you think what some of our students can do after 4 or 5 years, it's actually amazing that they can achieve what they do. I mean, you think of the speed of the input, huge demands it places on your working memory, having to cope with all the sounds, words, chunks, parsing the message for syntax to create meaning. It's a very, very tough thing to do. There's also the fact that certainly recently in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, some of the exams that 16-year-olds have to do are pretty tough. And so I think that's focused people on listening. How can we create better listeners? It's also the case that pupils tend to have a slightly negative view of listening lessons. I mean, for example, if you start a lesson by handing out a piece of paper, the first thing they're likely to say to you is, is this a test, sir? Is this a test, miss? Because sometimes listening feels like that. It's press play, hear something a couple of times, get some pauses, and then do your best to think of an answer, sometimes with a degree of guessing. So that's the kind of context. Is there something we can do to teach listening in a better way? Now, a bit of the theory here to start with. In the literature on this, reference is made to two types of listening, what's called top-down listening and bottom-up listening. So on the one hand, top-down listening, for example, let's say I were to talk to you about a film I'd seen recently, and you would come to that conversation listening to me with certain knowledge and expectations about the type of thing I'd talk about, because you know movies, you know the language of movies, you might even know me and the sort of things I talk about. So that's all the background knowledge that can help you make sense of a message. On the other hand, you've got the bottom-up listening skills. That's kind of like the deciphering, the decoding of the message. In other words, piecing together everything in the signal, whether it's to do with sounds, syllables, parts of words, phrases, etc., to derive meaning from the whole message. So there are two things going on, and both are important. There has been a feeling perhaps over the years that we've over-egged the comprehension side of things, and that we just assume that listening doesn't need to be taught. We just do comprehension. So typically in lessons, students might have to do true or false questions. They might have to answer questions, do matching exercises, gap fill, etc. And the result of what students do produces a product. Right or wrong answers. It's what John Field, who's a leading researcher, you can see on the right there of your screen, has called the comprehension model. You could call it a sort of product model. In other words, it's about right and wrong answers. Is there a different way of teaching listening that gives students more confidence and ultimately can help make them better listeners? Well, Beth Shepard from the University of Oregon, I think from memory, talks about moving towards a more balanced listening sort of instruction, where we put a greater focus on the process of listening, not the product. Now, if we add to that the research that's been done, for example, by Suzanne Graham from the University of Reading, and she talks about how students are really quite anxious about doing listening tasks. They feel they're guessing, they feel that they're not very good at it. They also say that they can't see the person who's talking to them. They're listening to audio or occasionally perhaps watching video. So they have to resort to kind of educated guessing and strategies to get answers. And this could make pupils feel as though they're not very good at it, that they're having to guess. It's what the psychologists call diminished self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is that feeling that you're good at something. And when you feel you're good at something, it gives you added motivation, you want to learn, and frankly, you're more likely to carry on with the subject later on. And Suzanne Graham has found that actually it's a powerful predictor of success in language learning. There's also the feeling that maybe with what we're doing now, some of the outcomes are disappointing and that some of our students really don't seem to understand that much. So just a bit more on anxiety and self-efficacy. It's suggested, therefore, from what we know, that perhaps if we could design the input and the activities to match with what pupils can do at the moment, then that will help. So, for example, this figure of 95-98% known words has been put out by Paul Nation in particular to recommend that any input we give students should be highly comprehensible. Now, whether it's 95% more, perhaps for more able pupils it's less, certainly with listening, chances are it's going to have to be even more comprehensible than with reading. Because if you think about reading, you've got the holes between the words, you've got the fact that you can scan back and scan forward. So it's an easier job, isn't it, than listening? It's also been suggested from this research that if we prepare students for tasks beforehand with pre-listening activities, that can help them carry out the task and reduce the anxiety. It's also the case, I think, that it's a good idea to speak or play language not too fast. In other words, don't worry, certainly in the early stages, about it sounding too authentic. Maybe there's room now and again to play some authentic language, but on the whole, we're not trying to catch kids out. We want them to feel that they're going to get some success. And lastly, we can train students in metacognitive strategies, thinking about the sort of tactics they can bring into play when they're listening. So when we talk about a process approach, what does this mean actually? So, typically in a lesson you might get a child saying, "Well, miss, I couldn't understand that part." You might say, "What couldn't you understand?" "Well, it just sounded like a noise. I couldn't work out the words." Can we break down the process for the pupil and build it up again to help them? Now, if you have a look there, you'll see this is a table from John Field's book, Teaching Listening in the Languages Classroom, which is a classic in its field. And he identifies all the different levels of processing that you have to do when you're listening. Now, let me give you a second to take in that page. Now, if you look down the left-hand column, we're starting off from the smallest bits of language, the phonemes, the individual sounds of a particular language, then moving to the level of syllables, then to the level of the word, then up to the level of whole sentence grammar, syntax. And he also includes what he calls intonation groups. In other words, those groups of words that go together which seem to be bound together by stress or by pitch, which together make up intonation. And if you break up each of these particular levels of processing, then he looks at them in a bit more detail there. Now, so the idea is, could we design lessons and activities that would help build up each of those skills individually? Now, I have to say, to start with, there are linguists who believe that this approach may be somewhat futile, that really all you need is to listen lots, and nature will take its course. You'll become a better listener. I don't take that view, except maybe for some of our most able linguists. I think it's sometimes our middle ability students and some of the weaker ones who might benefit most from breaking down the process of listening. So how can we match our teaching to this sort of research on process listening? Well, certainly number one has got to be do lots of listening. Do lots of listening to comprehensible material. I think it's quite easy as a teacher to overestimate how much students in front of you actually understand. And even quite able students might say to you at the end of the lesson, "Well, I didn't actually understand that, sir. I wasn't sure about that bit, miss." And there's a natural tendency for us to kind of think that the students can sometimes do too much. So whatever it takes to keep the input comprehensible, whether it's through all your tricks of the trade like gesture, body language, picture, occasional translation, just keep it comprehensible. Build into lessons, I'd suggest as much one-way and two-way listening as possible. One-way listening is, for example, playing an audio track. Two-way listening is the interpersonal listening that happens when you're working with a class or when pairs or groups are working together. And actually, in the end, it's probably two-way listening that's going to be the biggest producer of language and interesting input for students. I wouldn't worry about using occasional English. I'm certainly not sort of dogmatic about this. Sometimes you need a bit of English to make language comprehensible. And try and get that balance between comprehension and bottom-up process work. And I think probably the process material, what we're going to describe in a second, is probably particularly useful from year 7 to year 9. That's in England, so we're talking about beginners, say, starting at the age of 11, moving up to 14. By doing this, perhaps we can build up that feeling of self-efficacy and reduce anxiety and improve pupils' attitudes. That's the idea. So one or two examples here, and these are activities working at the level of phonology, phonemes, and phonics. Remember the difference here. Phonology is about sounds, the sounds of a particular language. Phonics is specifically about the relationship between sounds and graphemes, i.e. the spellings of words. So in this particular activity, and this is one of the many, many activities we've got in our book called Breaking the Sound Barrier, teaching language learners how to listen. And this is one we call Phonics Bingo. So for this one, as you can see from the instructions, then you make some bingo cards. You could either do this with individual letters or letter combinations, or maybe even words, short words, and then you read out sounds or short words which contain the sounds on the cards. And then the students tick off the sounds as they hear them, and then it carries out, as it normally does with bingo. So it just gets students sensitized to sounds, having fun with sounds. And one thing I'd say here is that when you're working with sounds, the danger is that you can end up with doing some quite dry lessons, kind of PowerPoint lessons where you're pointing out words on the board and highlighting letters and what they sound like. It can be very teacher-led. I think anything which can gamify sounds will make it more fun and be more profitable in the end. So that's Phonics Bingo. Another example from our book was the one we called Letters on the Board. And for this one, just show some letters or combinations of letters on the board and then read out some words or phrases. And then students have to transcribe the vocab only using the letters displayed. And if you use common words, maybe ones that they don't know yet. So that's always a good test of how good their phonics skill is, of course. Can they transcribe new words which they've never heard before based on their knowledge? Okay. So if you design this carefully, the words or phrases you say can then be pieced together, and students can make a sentence which they could read aloud and repeat chorally. And here's another real beginner sort of activity with a focus on phonology and phonics. For this one, just write some words or chunks on the board. Maybe choose words that have got sounds that are particularly challenging for students. For example, English learners of French, German or Spanish have trouble with the uvular R or the trilled R, and each language has its own problem sounds. Then all you do is simply write one of them secretly on your mini whiteboard, and students have to guess the hidden word. I mean, you beginners will do that all day long. They love guessing games, and it just gets them hearing words, sounds rather, in a sort of non-threatening context, as it were, and that can be quite fun. Another one I do, which I used to do quite a bit, and which I sometimes demonstrate if I ever go and do teacher conferences or anything, is to give pairs of words, and then students would have to work out whether the two words sound the same or if they're different. So, for example, if you're listening now, I could give you these two words, and I want you to think to yourself, do these words sound the same or are they different? So here's the first pair. Same or different? Do. Do. And hopefully you thought they were the same. Now try this pair. Do. Do. Same or different? Well, they were pretty much the same. Here's another pair. Listen again. Do. Do. Well, if you've got good ears there, you will have noticed that the phoneme was pretty much the same, but the intonation changed, didn't it? So if you were doing that with a class, that might be a way to get into talking about pitch of the voice. And last pair, try these. du, du, and hopefully you heard the difference. And in languages like German and French, that difference between u and u is a really important one for meaning, and one if your students can get right early on, that's great. I would say that all the sorts of little exercises you do like this, and particularly accurate reading aloud and phonics work, if you can get those nailed in the first few months of learning, you've probably got your students for the next 5 years. What can go wrong, and certainly what the research shows, is that if these things aren't fixed early, then we get, by the 3rd or 4th year of learning, students who simply can't read aloud very well. And as I'm going to explain later, perhaps in another video, actually pronouncing well is really important for listening because of the way that we hold words in our memory. We need to hold the phonological variety of the word in memory, not just the spelling of it. So that's just my very brief starter presentation on a process approach, and I'm going to develop this more in the next couple of presentations, and the focus will still be on listening. And then in later recordings I'm going to do work on grammar, reading, exploiting texts, all sorts of things. I think I've probably got 30 or 40 presentations lined up, hopefully 15 to 20 minutes for each one, we'll see. So bite-sized chunks. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you come and listen to the next one. Thanks so much for listening. It's Steve Smith signing off. Bye.